The wagon lurched once, hard, and then the world went sideways. Clover didn't have time to grab the rail. One moment she was sitting on the bench with her valise between her feet and the grey Colorado sky overhead. And the next she was in the air, and then she was on the ground, and the ground was frozen, solid, and it did not care about her, at all, for a moment. Somewhere behind her she could hear the driver shouting at the horses. Somewhere behind her, wheels spinning against ice, then the crack of the whip, and hooves, and the sound of the wagon pulling away, and then nothing. Just the wind moving through the pines and a high, thin ringing in her left ear. She pushed herself up onto her hands. Her palms were bleeding through her gloves. The valise was nowhere. The road, if it could be called that, curved around the mountain face and disappeared. The wagon was gone. The driver had not looked back. She wasn't certain he'd even known she'd fallen. The thought arrived quietly and settled in her chest like cold water. Clover stood. Her right knee screamed at her. She ignored it the way she'd been ignoring things for the better part of 6 months and looked around. Trees, rock, snow packed into the gullies between the trees. The road running east, the way they'd come from Hatchfield, and ahead, somewhere over the ridge, a town called Dunmore, where her mother's sister had a boarding house and a spare room, and had written, "Come soon, Clover, come before winter closes the pass." She had not come soon enough. The light was already failing. That was the thing about October in the mountains. It didn't warn you. 1 hour the sky was white and flat and manageable, and the next it was the color of a bruise and dropping fast. She knew this the way she knew most things about the mountains. Theoretically, from letters from her mother's stories, never from her own body. She started walking east, then she stopped. East was Hatchfield. East was the office of her father's solicitor, and the stack of papers that said the house was no longer hers, and the debts were not forgiven, just because her father was dead. East was the last 6 months of her life collapsing in on themselves like a building with no foundation. She turned west. She walked until her knee stopped screaming and started simply aching, which she took as progress. The road narrowed to a track, and the track narrowed to something that might have been a game path. She was not certain she was still on it. The trees grew closer together here, and darker, and the snow on the ground was untouched, except for the small signatures of animals she couldn't name. She heard the smoke before she smelled it. That was the wrong order, and she knew it. And then she understood that she was so cold that her nose had stopped working properly, and then she smelled it. Wood smoke, real and close, curling down through the pines, from somewhere above her and to the left. She climbed toward it. The cabin sat in a clearing that didn't seem large enough to contain it. It was built from dark timber, low and long, with a roof that sloped steeply on both sides, and a porch that ran the full length of the front wall. There were pelts stretched on frames near the door. There was a stack of wood that reached the eave. There was a man standing at the edge of the porch with a rifle, and he was watching her. Clover stopped at the tree line. He didn't move. He was large in the way that mountains were large, not just tall but broad, filling the space he occupied in a way that made the porch behind him look smaller than it was. He wore a heavy canvas coat, and his boots were laced up to the knee, and his beard was the color of old copper, shot through with gray. The rifle was at his side, not raised, but his hand was on it. She said, "My wagon overturned on the road. I'm trying to get to Dunmore." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved the smoke from the chimney sideways. "Dunmore's 12 miles, he said. Roads iced over past the creek crossing. She waited for more. He didn't offer any. "Is there somewhere closer I could?" She stopped. She didn't know how to finish the sentence without sounding like she was asking for something she had no right to ask for. "I don't have money," she said instead, which was the truest thing she could say. He studied her the way she imagined. He studied the tree line when he was listening for something, carefully, without urgency, with a quality of attention that was neither warm nor hostile, but simply complete. "You're bleeding through your gloves," he said. "I know." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he tilted his head toward the door. "Come in," he said, "before you fall down on my porch." His name was Moss. He told her this, the way he told her everything's. Flatly, without decoration, as though words were a resource he had learned to conserve. He told her the creek crossing flooded in the fall and froze badly and couldn't be trusted until deep winter, when it was solid all the way through. He told her the nearest settlement was 7 miles south and mostly abandoned. He told her there was dried elk in the pot, and she could eat. He did not tell her anything about himself, beyond the name and the geography. She didn't ask. She sat at a table made from a single slab of wood and ate from a tin bowl, and tried not to look at the rifle on its hooks above the door, or the skinning knife on the counter, or the way the firelight made the pelt-covered walls look like something alive and breathing. She was not afraid of him. That surprised her, but she examined it and found it was true. He moved around the small space with an economy of motion that made her think of someone who had lived alone long enough to know exactly where everything was in the dark. He did not crowd her. He did not watch her eat. He stood at the window and looked out at the last and said nothing. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. He considered the question as though it required some calculation. 9 years. She looked at his back. Alone? Yes. She thought about 9 years alone on a mountain, and found she couldn't hold the shape of it in her mind. 6 months living in her father's house after he died, managing the lawyers and the creditors, and the slow dissolution of everything she'd known, had felt like a sentence. Alone? Why? She said. He didn't turn around. It suited me. She didn't ask what had suited him about it. Some questions were just walls with the word "why" painted on them. He gave her the bed, a narrow thing against the far wall, built into the cabin the way bunks were built into ships, with a straw mattress and 2 heavy wool blankets. He slept in the chair by the fire, or didn't sleep. She wasn't sure. When she woke in the night, she could see the back of his head in the firelight, and hear the snow starting outside, tapping against the oilskin windows, and she lay still and listened to it and felt, strangely, that she was not afraid. In the morning the snow was serious. She stood at the window and looked at it. 6 inches, maybe 7, and still coming. The pines had gone white and shapeless, and the track she'd come up was gone entirely. The pond and Moss was already outside. She could see him through the window, moving between the cabin and a smaller structure she hadn't noticed the night before. A shed or a smokehouse, set back from the clearing. He was carrying something heavy, not laboring with it, just moving steadily the way he seemed to do everything. She put on her coat and went out. The cold took her breath in a way that was almost personal. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward him. "How long?" she said. He looked at the sky. The sky was the color of pewter and entirely uniform, cloud all the way down to the tree line. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4. After that, road will be passable. Down to the ford. Anyway, she looked at the snow. She thought about her aunt's boarding house and the spare room and the letter that said, "Come soon." She thought about the solicitor's office and the papers she hadn't signed yet, the final papers, the ones that would make it all official and final and done. She thought about the fact that she had 37 cents in the pocket of her coat and no valise and no plan beyond West. "Can I be useful?" she said. He looked at her with the same flat attention he'd given her at the tree line the night before. "You know how to split wood?" "No." "You know how to salt meat?" "No." "You know how to do anything that isn't?" He paused, looking at her hands, her coat, her city boots that were already soaked through at the toes. "Whatever it is you were doing before you fell off that wagon." "I can read," she said. "I can write. I can keep accounts. I kept my father's accounts for 3 years." He said nothing. She had the sense that this information was filing itself away somewhere, but that it was not at present of any practical use to him. "I can learn," she said. He handed her the thing he was carrying. It was a log, roughly 2 feet long and heavy. "Woodpile," he said, "around the side." She carried it around the side. She made 11 trips before her arms gave out. When she came back around the corner, Moss was splitting a log with the kind of effortless precision that made her feel the previous 11 trips had been slightly ridiculous. He didn't look up. She went backside and found the pot and stoked the fire under it, and decided that being useful was simply a matter of finding the next thing and doing it, even if you didn't know how yet. The snow kept them for 4 days. She learned to salt meat on the second day, from watching him do it, and then doing it herself while he watched. He corrected her once, without looking up from what he was doing, the angle of the knife, the direction of the grain, and then didn't correct her again. She understood that this was a form of confidence, however minimal. She learned that he had come to the mountain after something she wasn't going to ask about. She understood this not from anything he said, but from the way he never mentioned any other place, any other person, any previous version of himself. Most people, even people who didn't like to talk, left the outlines of their past lying around. He had no outlines. He had only this: the cabin, the pelts, the woodpile, the frozen creek. She told him about the house. She wasn't sure why she did it. They were sitting at the table on the second evening, and the snow was still coming, and he had made a kind of stew from the dried elk and some roots she hadn't recognized, and she was tired enough that her guard was somewhere on the floor, and she said, "My father died in the spring. The house was mortgaged. I didn't know how much." He looked at the table. "The creditors were very patient," she said. "They waited until summer to start knocking." She paused. "They weren't actually patient. They just wanted more time to add to the total." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you going?" "My aunt, Dunmore. She has a boarding house." She looked at her hands. "She doesn't know." "I'm coming with nothing." "Does she know you're coming at all?" "I wrote a letter in September." "Did she write back?" Clover considered this. The letter had been mailed from Hatchfield, which was a 4-day ride from Dunmore, and she had left Hatchfield 2 weeks later without waiting for a reply. "I didn't give her time to write back," she said. Something that might have been a reaction crossed his face. It was gone before she could name it. He stood and took the bowls to the bucket and didn't say anything else, and she thought that was the end of it. Then he said, from across the room with his back to her, "She'll take you in." She looked at him. "You don't know that?" "No," he said. "But people generally do when family shows up in winter." She thought about this for a long time. After he went back to his chair, she thought about the fact that he said it at all, this man who spoke fewer words in a day than most people spoke in an hour. She thought about what it meant that he had chosen this particular thing to say. She decided it was the closest thing to kindness she'd encountered in 6 months she'd encountered, months, and she let herself hold it carefully, like something that might break. On the third night, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and the fire wasn't keeping up. Moss banked it as high as he could, and then sat down in his chair and pulled a blanket over his legs and said, without looking at her, "It'll be cold before morning." She was already in the bed with both wool blankets and her coat on top of them, and she could feel the cold coming through the wall at her back. "How cold does it get?" she said. "Cold enough to matter." She lay there for a while. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind was doing something low and serious against the roof. She thought about the road. She thought about 12 miles in this. She thought about her 37 cents. "Moss," she said. He didn't answer. She thought he might be asleep. "Thank you," she said, "for the door. Last night, the first night." A long silence. Then, "Go to sleep, Clover." She went to sleep. The snow stopped on the morning of the 4th day. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard in weeks. She stepped out onto the porch, and the world was white and perfectly still, and the sky had gone, a hard, clear blue that felt like a promise being made to someone. Her breath came out in a long white cloud. Her boots creaked on the frost. Moss came around the side of the cabin with an axe on his shoulder. He looked at the sky the way she'd already learned. He looked at everything he was trying to read. Then he looked at her. "Creek'll take another day to settle," he said. "Safer tomorrow." She nodded. She had known this, more or less. She stood on the porch and looked at the mountains going white and silent in every direction, and felt something in her chest that she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't peace exactly. It was more like the absence of the thing that had been pressing on her since April, the noise of other people's urgency, the constant low hum of owing and owing and owing. She heard herself say, "What do you do in winter?" He looked at her. "What do you mean? When the snow traps you, for weeks, for months." He was quiet for a moment. "Check the traps, cut wood, repair what's broken, smoke what needs smoking." He paused. "Think. About what?" "Whatever wants thinking about." She looked at the mountains. She thought that this was either the loneliest thing she'd ever heard or the most sensible, and she wasn't sure which. "Could you use a hand?" she said. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had at the tree line on the first night. Complete, unhurried attention. "For what?" he said. "You're going to Dunmore." "I know," she said. "I'm asking about tomorrow." He studied her a moment longer. Then he turned and went back around the side of the cabin. "Come here," he said. "I'll show you the traps." She stayed 2 more days after the snow stopped. The first was practical. The first uncertain. The creek was still at her, standing at its edge, exactly what safe ice sounded like when you tested it with the heel of your boot versus what compromised ice sounded like, and she understood that this was information she needed, and that he was giving it to her as simply as he'd given her the log on the first day. The second was harder to explain. She woke early and lay in the narrow bed and listened to the cabin. She could hear him outside already. Boots on frozen ground, the small sounds of a man who had made his peace with the hours before dawn. She could smell coffee, real coffee, not the chicory he'd been stretching it with, so he'd opened the good tin. She lay there and thought about her aunt's boarding house, and the spare room and the life she was going to build in it. Small and careful and starting from 37 cents. And she thought about the letter she hadn't waited for a reply to, and she thought about the creditors in Hatchfield who would find out eventually that she'd left, and she thought, "This is the last ants morning." She got up and went outside. Moss was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking south. The road, visible now that the snow had settled and compressed, ran down through the trees, pale and passable in the early light. "It'll hold," she said. "Should." She stood beside him and looked at the road. She thought about 12 miles. She thought about what waited at the end of 12 miles, and what waited at the end of the thing after that, and the thing after that. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You salted 40 pounds of elk," he said, "and you didn't complain about the cold." She almost laughed. It came out as something softer than a laugh, surprised at itself. "That's a low bar," she said. "Most people don't clear it," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the road. His jaw was set in the way that meant he was deciding whether to say something, and she had learned in 4 days to recognize this, the way she'd learned to recognize the sound of bad ice. "If Dunmore doesn't suit you," he said. Not slowly, like something he'd decided to get over with. "There's work here, real work. I could use someone who keeps accounts." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have accounts." "I would," he said, "if I had someone who kept them." She looked at the road again. She thought about the word suit. She thought about whether a spare room in a boarding house, in a town she'd never seen, with an aunt who didn't know she was coming, could be said to suit her in any sense that mattered. She thought about what she wanted, which was a thing she had not allowed herself to think about for 6 months, because wanting had felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The road waited. The mountains waited. The morning light moved down through the pines in long straight lines, and the smoke from the cabin chimney went up, and Moss stood beside her, with the same stillness he brought to everything. not pushing, not withdrawing. Just there, she said. The traps need checking this afternoon. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. Show me how to read the sign, she said. The marks in the snow, what means what? He looked at her then. Something shifted in his face that wasn't a smile exactly, but was in the neighborhood of one. A kind of settling, like a thing that had been waiting had found its footing. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a strip of dried elk and handed it to her. Breakfast first, he said. Then the traps. 3 weeks later, a man named Doyle came up the road with a mule and a sack of flour and coffee, and the kind of studied incuriosity that meant he'd been told Moss had company and was pretending not to be interested. Clover was at the side of the cabin, working a scraper along the inside of a beaver pelt the way Moss had shown her, the smell of it cutting and animal and real. Her hands had stopped being soft. Somewhere around the second week, she heard the mule's hooves and stood up. Doyle pulled up at the edge of the clearing. He looked at her. He looked at Moss, who had come around from the woodpile. He looked back at Clover with the beaver pelt in her hands. Morning, Doyle said. Doyle, Moss said, brought the flour and the coffee. He reached back into the mule's pack, and there's a letter came through on the Dunmore run. He held it out toward Moss, then looked at Clover. It's got a woman's name on it. Clover set down the scraper and took the letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, not the solicitor, not the creditors. She turned it over and looked at the return address and felt something close in her throat. Dunmore. Her aunt's hand. She opened it standing there in the clearing with Doyle watching and Moss watching and the mountains watching, and she read it in about 30 seconds, and then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Doyle waited. Bad news? No, she said. She picked up the scraper. Put the flour in the shed, please, and the coffee. He looked at Moss. Moss said nothing, just tilted his head toward the shed. Doyle unloaded the mule in a pointed, curious silence. He left the way he'd come, looking back once, from the tree line. Clover finished the pelt. The sun was already past the high point and dropping toward the ridge, which meant 3 hours of decent light left, and the traps on the north line hadn't been checked in 2 days. She could feel Moss behind her, not saying anything, waiting the way he waited for everything. She turned around. My aunt says the room is still available, she said. She says to come before the deep freeze. Moss looked at her. The light was on the side of his face, and his expression was that careful, unhurried attention was the most honest thing he had. Are you going? He said. She thought about the room. She thought about available, which was not the same as wanted, and not the same as come. Now. We've been waiting. She thought about what it meant that her aunt had addressed the letter to the woman at Moss Coulter's place, as though this were simply information that had made its way down to Dunmore on its own, as though Clover had, in some way she hadn't formally decided, already arrived. Somewhere. The north traps, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went and got his coat from inside the door and tossed hers to her, and they walked out together into the late afternoon, into the snow that was old and compressed and good for reading sign, and the mountains held them in their cold, indifferent way that was not warmth, but was anything from you except your full attention. That was enough. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first thing in a long time that had been exactly what it was.